Good evening. Welcome back, traveler. I'm glad you found your way here again, to the quiet edge of another long night. This is Longform, and the fire has been kept low for you, just enough to paint the room in a soft amber glow. Whether you're here to follow every thread of the tale wide awake, or simply to let a calm voice and an old story keep you company as sleep slowly pulls you under, you are welcome. Outside, the city is distant. In here, the only sounds are the faint hiss of imagined rain beyond the windows and the slow breath of the embers tonight. We turn our attention to a man whose choices set Yharnam on its burning path. A scholar, a priest, and eventually something far less human. Tonight, we keep watch with Laurence, the first vicar, and the fire-soaked betrayal that followed in his footsteps. Imagine, for a moment, that you stand alone in the grand cathedral. The pews are empty. The vast stone hall is wrapped in a deep blue darkness, the kind that makes candle flames seem very small. Stained glass windows sleep in the walls like frozen eyes, their colors barely alive in the low light high above. The vaulted ceiling disappears into shadow, and the air smells faintly of old incense and cooled ash. At the far end of this hall, upon the elevated altar, rests a single curious relic, a skull, weathered and pale, set upon rich cloth and surrounded by draped vestments, as if every thread of the fabric remembers kneeling crowds and whispered prayers in the waking city of Yharnam. This altar relic is tied to the memory of Laurence, the first vicar of the healing church, the man whose blood rights once defined the life of the city. But the truth of him is not held by this waking shrine alone. Somewhere else, in a place where guilt and memory knot together into a world of their own, his true human skull lies bound to the nightmare, a fragment of the man he was before the blood turned him into the first cleric beast. It is there, in that other layer of reality, that the last echoes of his past are said to cling to bone. For now, though, imagine only that the skull before you is quiet. It cannot speak, so we will speak for it. Let the cathedral fade. Let the candlelight draw back into a soft glow, and the stone floor beneath your feet soften into memory. We will go backwards, through dust and time, to a calmer shore before the blood tides rose, before cathedrals crowned the city, when Laurence was not yet a vicar, and Yharnam was still only a place on a map. Far from the cramped streets and towering bridges, there was once a school, Byrgenwerth. You might picture it standing on the edge of a misted lake, its buildings old, but not yet haunted, its lecture halls warm with the lamplight and quiet conversation. Study and curiosity hang in the air there like a second atmosphere. Shelves groan under the weight of books, and ancient secrets lie buried not only in texts, but in the earth itself beneath the school. Among the scholars who walk those echoing halls is a young man named Laurence. He is not yet wrapped in church vestments or praised by crowds. In those days, he wears the same simple garments as his peers, ink on his fingers, dust on his boots from the library stairs. Even then, he is drawn toward the deeper questions that cling to Byrgenwerth like fog along the water. At the head of the school stands Master Willem, a quiet, severe figure who believes that true evolution lies not in the body, but in the mind. We require more eyes, he teaches, eyes on the inside. Not more blood, not more force, not more hunger, just more understanding. Around him, gather a circle of students and fellow scholars. hunters, scribes, seekers of secrets. Laurence is one of these. Perhaps he sits near the front in lectures, listening as Willem paces slowly before a blackboard crowded with strange diagrams. Perhaps he lingers afterward with questions that burn brighter than the lamps. What they study is not ordinary. Beneath the earth, under Johannem's foundations and the grounds around Bergenwerth, lie remnants of an older civilization, labyrinths of stone and shadow built by people who walked this world long before. Through excavations and rites, the scholars of Bergenwerth reach down into this forgotten place, and in its depths they find blood. Not the thin, ordinary cloth red that everyone carries in their veins, but something thicker, stranger, with a glow in it like a buried star, old blood. They call it a substance drawn from beings far beyond human comprehension, the great ones whose traces sleep in those ancient halls. The first time Laurence sees its effects, it must feel like a miracle. A dying patient, veins failing, lungs rattling in a bed that smells of sickness and damp linen. A few drops of this old blood, carefully administered, and the color returns to the patient's face. Breath steadies. Limbs that had been heavy with weakness find strength again. To watch that, to stand at the foot of such a bed and see life pull back from the brink, would move almost anyone. To someone like Laurence, with a keen mind and a heart inclined toward grand solutions, it seems like an answer. An end to needless death. A new dawn for healing. Around him, though, not every pair of eyes shines with the same excitement. Master Willem watches too, but where Laurence sees a miracle, Willem feels a warning. He studies the blood's strange glow, its hints of power beyond the human frame, and he sees a path that does not lead to gentle cures or quiet wards. He sees a cliff edge. Fear the old blood, he says, again and again, like a prayer or a warding charm. The phrase is simple, but the weight behind it is not. In his view, to meddle with such a substance is to invite forces that do not think as humans do. Forces that might use mankind as a stepping stone or a vessel rather than a partner. In those early days, this is not yet a shouted argument. It is a tension, quiet and growing. Laurence admires Willem. He has studied under him, absorbed his methods, shared in his discoveries. But where Willem's caution grows, Laurence's hope deepens. He stands between hospital beds and lecture halls, between suffering patients and shelves of theory, and the distance between them begins to feel unbearable. On one side, sickness that could perhaps be eased. On the other, a philosophy that urges restraint and observation and slow accumulation of insight. There are choices that announce themselves with thunder and lightning, and there are choices that arrive like a slow tide, almost unnoticed until the water is at your knees. For Laurence, the tide of decision rises with every person he watches suffer, with every experiment that suggests the old blood can mend what is broken, with every quiet shake of Willem's head when the subject of wider use is raised. In the evenings, perhaps, after the lamps are turned low, he stands at the balcony rail of Bergenwerth, looking out over the mist on the lake, listening to the gentle lap of water against stone. Behind him, the halls of the school murmur with theories and the soft scratching of quills. Ahead of him, he can imagine a city healed by what they have found. A city, not just a school. It is in that quiet space between one breath and the next that the first fracture forms. Not yet a break, not yet a betrayal, but a fault line inside Laurence's heart. running between devotion to his teacher and devotion to the people who might be saved. Time moves on. The scholars delve deeper into the labyrinth. More old blood is brought up into the light. More patients are treated in guarded rooms where lamplight flickers over metal instruments and pale faces. Signs of trouble are there, even then, if one knows how to read them. Some patients heal, yes. Others recover only to speak of strange dreams, distant, towering silhouettes glimpsed behind their eyelids, whispers that are not quite voices, threads of thought weaving through their minds in the small hours of the night, a handful change in other ways, subtle shifts in posture, in appetite, in the way their eyes linger on others just a little too long. Willem sees these things and feels his fear confirmed. Laurence sees them and feels that the answer lies not in turning away, but in understanding more. If the blood heals and harms, can they not find a way to separate the blessing from the curse? If the cost is high, could wisdom not lower it? To withdraw, to refuse, feels to him like abandoning the world to its slow decay. The arguments between student and master become sharper. Perhaps one evening, in a lamplit office lined with books, Willem's hand rests on a desk between them as he speaks. Voice low but firm. Fear the old blood. Not a suggestion, a verdict. Across from him, Laurence stands very still. His own hands, gloved for the sick room, curl slowly into his palms. He has seen too much suffering to walk away from a possible cure, no matter how dangerous. To him, fear alone cannot be the answer. Fear does not mend bones, does not clear lungs, does not lift children back into their parents' arms. He can respect his master. He can even love him in the way a devoted student might, but he cannot follow him down a path of paralysis. In that moment, a quiet decision aligns inside him like falling stones. He will not fear the old blood. He will use it. He will take what Bergenworth has found and carry it beyond the school's cautious walls, into the city that sprawls in the valley below, into Johannem, where disease and injury and despair wait in cramped rooms and narrow streets. The night he leaves may not be recorded in any book. No choir of witnesses, no official ceremony. Perhaps only the creak of the main gate, the chill of the air outside, and the soft lap of the lake behind him. Willem remains within, surrounded by his theories and his warnings. Laurence steps out, carrying the knowledge of the old blood, and a vision that will change the face of Johannem forever. Behind him, the school stands like a dark silhouette against the mist. Ahead of him, the road bends down toward the city, its lamps marking the way like small, distant stars. He walks toward them, unaware that, in doing so, he is also walking toward a future of cathedrals, ornamented with beasts, streets slick with blood, and a skull that will one day lie in a nightmare, forever out of reach of the man who once wore it. For now, though, the road is quiet. The night around him is still. The man who will become the first vicar is only a man with a conviction, and the betrayal he will one day embody is still only a spark, resting unseen in the depths of the blood he carries. The road from Bergenworth to Johannem is not long on a map, but in the story of this world, it might as well be an ocean. Behind Laurence lies the quiet lake, the school, and the echo of his master's warning. Ahead of him, the city waits, rising from the fog like a mass of stone and chimneys and half-heard prayers. There is no fanfare when he arrives. No trumpets, no carved plaques, just another man with a satchel of notes, a mind full of forbidden knowledge, and vials of something that glows faintly when the light catches it. You can imagine his first steps into Yeharnam as cautious ones. The streets are narrow here, paved in worn stone that has seen more rain than sunlight. Tall houses lean close together, their windows like tired eyes watching the road. In cramped rooms above shop fronts, sickness is not a theory. It is a cough in the next room, a fever in a child's face, a worn cloth on a parent's lap, stained with blood that is only human, only fragile. Laurence does not arrive as a vicar. That title will come later, when marble pillars and soaring cathedrals have grown around his ideas. For now, perhaps he enters as a physician, or something very close to one. A scholar who has walked away from his old master, with a conviction that the knowledge they unearthed cannot remain trapped in books and sealed chambers. Somewhere in the city, a door opens for him. It could be a humble clinic at first, little more than a row of beds, a shelf of tinctures, and a basin by the window. The smell inside is familiar to anyone who has known illness: sweat, sour cloth, a trace of herbs that hardly cover the scent of fear. The people who lie here have run out of options. Ordinary tonics have failed. Ordinary doctors have shaken their heads and stepped away. Laurence steps forward, carrying something Yeharnam has not yet seen in such a pure, concentrated form. The old blood, drawn up from the labyrinth below the earth, now poured into vials fit for a healer's hand. It is not presented as something alien or monstrous. It is offered as a sacrament, a medicine, a last hope. A few drops into the vein, a careful watch over the patient, and then change. At first, the change is everything he hoped for. The color returns to cheeks that had gone gray. Breaths that rattle become smooth and steady. Limbs that once trembled with weakness grow firm, hands curling with new strength. In the dim light of the clinic, it must have looked like a small miracle. And in a city that has seen too much grief, one miracle is enough to send whispers out into the streets. Word spreads, as it always does. A neighbor who hears that someone's dying father has sat up again. A trader whose chronic pain eases after a visit to a new kind of doctor. A child who can once more run along the narrow alleys without stopping to gasp for breath. People speak of a strange, potent blood being used in treatments. They speak of a man who knows how to wield it. Laurence does not stay alone for long. Others join him, drawn from the ranks of former scholars, physicians, and the devout. Some may have followed him from Bürgenwerth, quietly sharing his belief that fear alone cannot govern the use of what they found. Others may be Yeharnamites, clergy and laymen who see, in this strange new practice, the outline of something holy. As the days pass and the years begin to turn, the work at the clinic grows beyond its walls. What began as experimentation and desperate healing, hidden away in small corners, starts to take on the shape of an institution. Symbols appear, ritual phrases are spoken. The act of receiving blood becomes more than a treatment. It becomes a rite. Those who administer it do not simply pour a liquid. They preside, like priests, over a quiet transaction between sickness and something that claims to be salvation. The healing church does not spring fully formed from nothing. It rises, piece by piece, out of the mingling of need and belief. A simple chapel is refurbished into something grander. Candles multiply along the aisles. Statues are raised, their stone eyes cast upward toward heights that the people of Yeharnam can barely imagine. The architecture begins to stretch, reaching up and up, as if the walls themselves are trying to touch whatever ancient, distant power sleeps in the blood they venerate. Laurence is at the center of this slow transformation. You might picture him standing at the front of a growing congregation, the first hints of clerical vestments draped over his shoulders. His hands, once stained mainly with ink and the dust of books, now carry the faint scent of incense and blood. People come to him not only for healing, but for guidance, for meaning, for a way to understand what is happening to them. The old blood is no longer just a tool of scholars. It has become the heart of a faith. To receive this blood is not merely to seek a cure, but to participate in something sacred. The Church speaks of transcending human limits, of stepping onto a higher plane, of a path that leads beyond ordinary flesh. The language is lofty, and in candlelit halls, it sounds convincing. Jehannam, long weighed down by disease and hardship, finds in these promises a reason to look upward. The city changes to reflect this. Bridges are reinforced to carry the flow of pilgrims. Cathedrals rise in the higher districts, their steps worn smooth by countless feet. Clinics and small chapels spread outward, like vessels branching from a great central heart in time. The very idea of Jehannam becomes inseparable from the healing church. To live in the city is to live under its towers, to walk through streets where its symbols hang from doorways and its choirs sing in the night. But even as the church grows, a quieter pattern emerges beneath the hymns and processions. Not every story ends with a cure. In the back rooms of clinics, some patients do not simply rise from their beds. They toss and turn, muttering in their sleep, as if haunted by dreams they cannot escape. Some speak of towering figures that loom over them when they close their eyes, their shapes blurred and vast. Others wake with a start, insisting they heard a voice whispering just at the edge of thought, a voice they cannot quite remember by morning. The church records these things in its own way. Perhaps ascribe notes in the margin of a ledger that a particular dose brought on strange visions. Perhaps a quiet debate rises among the clerics over whether certain symptoms should be attributed to the blood itself or to the frailty of the recipients. The public face of the church, though, remains bright. The sermons speak of triumph. The banners flutter in the breeze above the plazas. Somewhere within this growing institution, a new need emerges. If the blood can cure and bless, it can also unmake. When a patient's body twists too far under its influence, when teeth lengthen and eyes gleam with an animal hunger, it is no longer a matter for physicians alone. Something else is required. Someone who can step into the dark when the miracle turns against its recipient. Hunters. At first, they are not yet the famous figures they will later become. In those early years, they gather under the guidance of a craftsman hunter, whose small workshop, tucked away from the main cathedral, begins to turn out strange, transforming weapons and practical gear. These first hunters walk a line between healer and executioner, called in when the church's rites give way to something that must be faced with steel instead of prayer. They work in the shadows of the church's bright promises, cleaning up the signs that the old blood is not as tame as their leaders would like the world to believe. It is widely known later that Ludwig will rise as the first great hunter of the healing church itself, turning this rough necessity into a formal order. But these beginnings are humbler, born of panicked nights and desperate improvisation. A clerk who picks up a weapon because there is no one else. A doctor who learns to fight because his patients will devour him otherwise. Laurence watches this all unfold, He sees the results of his conviction, the healed, the grateful, the faithful. He also sees, or chooses whether to see, the others, the ones who lose themselves, the ones whose faces must be covered when they are carried out through back doors, long after the last hymn has faded from the cathedral. In quiet hours, when the halls are empty and the candles have burned low, he may sit alone in one of the high chambers of the grand cathedral, looking out over the rooftops of Jehannam. The city lights are scattered below like embers. The church's towers rise above them, proud and tall, like fingers raised toward some distant, unseen sky. Did he feel doubt in those hours? We cannot know. The world leaves his inner thoughts unvoiced, his journals unreadable to us. But based on what we see of his legacy, it may be that he clung more tightly to his vision as the dangers grew, not less. To admit that the old blood was too dangerous would be to admit that he had built his entire life and the city's faith on a mistake. So the church doubles down. The rites become more intricate, the sermons more insistent. Hunters are trained more thoroughly, their methods refined, their tools improved. Steel and trick weapons are blessed in the church's name, and the act of slaying a beast becomes, in its own way, a sacred duty, a necessary shadow under the sun of healing. The people of Jehannam see only part of this picture. They see the lines outside clinics on cold mornings, weary faces lit with a strange kind of hope. They see banners unfurled on feast days, processions winding through the streets with candles and song. They hear rumors, yes, of creatures seen in alleys when the moon is high, of hunts carried out behind closed doors. But the church assures them that everything is under control, that all of this is simply the cost of progress, the growing pains of a city on the verge of ascension. Some neighborhoods, though, begin to feel the weight more heavily than others. In the lower quarters, where the stone is stained darker and the air tastes of smoke, people notice that the number of those taken for treatment rises with each season. They notice that, once in a while, someone does not come back, or if they do, they return changed, quieter, their eyes not quite meeting anyone else's for long. The first whispers of unease begin to weave through the walls of Jehannam's houses. They are soft at first, easily drowned out by the ringing of cathedral bells and the confident footsteps of church officials crossing the plazas. But they are there, like hairline cracks in a fine porcelain, tiny, almost invisible, but spreading slowly, patiently, beneath the glaze. Laurence continues to move at the heart of it all. To those who see him from afar, he is the first vicar now, a figure of authority robed in rich cloth, surrounded by attendants and symbols of power. To those who stand closer, perhaps he is still the same man who once walked the halls of Bergenwerth, voice steady as he explained new theories, eyes bright with the conviction that he is leading humanity towards something greater. Outside, the city's chimneys continue to cough smoke into the sky. Inside, in the high halls of the healing church, lamps burn late into the night. Charts and diagrams cover tables. Vials of blood gleam softly in rows. Hunters come and go, their boots clicking on stone, their coats smelling faintly of beasts and gunpowder. The machinery of this new faith turns, every gear oiled by blood, every wheel guided intentionally or not by Laurence's original choice. For now, the hymns to the healing church still drown out the distant sounds of fear. For now, the flames that will one day wrap themselves around a whole district of Jehannam are still quiet, sleeping in barrels of oil and unlit torches. The betrayal at the heart of this story remains half hidden, wrapped in good intentions and golden vestments. For now, the city believes that the fire is on their side. In any city built on promises, there comes a moment when the promises are tested. For Jahannam, that test begins in a neighborhood that will, in time, lie in cinders and ash. Old Jahannam was once simply Jahannam. Narrow streets, low houses, chimneys breathing their thin smoke into a sky that was often more grey than blue. The people there were not rich, but they were rooted. Families layered over the same few streets for generations, stones worn smooth by the passing of countless feet. It begins, they say, with an illness in the blood. Ashen blood, some call it. A wasting sickness that leaves people pale and feverish, strength drained away as if some unseen hand has reached into their veins. Coughs echo between the brick walls, and the taste of iron lingers in the air. Doors close a little earlier each evening. Windows stay latched, curtains drawn. Into this comes the healing church. They arrive when hope is thinning, just as they have in other corners of the city. Clerics and attendants, bearing vials of old blood that glow faintly in the light of the alley lamps. They speak gently. They assure the people that this sickness too can be cured. The church has come prepared. The first patients to receive the treatment in Old Jahannam must feel the same strange miracle that earlier desperate souls have known. Colour returns, breath steadies, joints no longer ache as they did before. Even those who had resigned themselves to an early death feel a new heat kindling in their limbs. The church, once again, seems to stand between the people and the worst that life can offer. Trust is a fragile thing, but it grows quickly when watered by relief. Soon, Old Jahannam is awash in the church's presence. Clinics are busy, and the sight of robed clerics carrying their sacred vials becomes as familiar as the cries of street vendors and the clatter of wagon wheels. To question the source of this miracle is, for most, unthinkable. When one has been pulled back from the edge, the hand that did the pulling is not lightly doubted. But where the blood flows most freely, its shadow follows. At first, the changes are small. A man cured of his fever finds that his temper flares more easily, and his appetite grows strange. A woman whose lungs no longer rattle discovers that her sleep is filled with restless dreams, full of shadowy figures and distant ringing bells. Children healed of their frailties sometimes stare too long at the moon. And then, as the months pass and the treatments multiply, the changes become harder to hide. Some patients grow stronger than seems natural, their muscles corded with a taut, restless energy. Nails thicken, teeth sharpen just a little. Their movements take on a certain tension, like a rope stretched too tight. In the close-packed homes of Old Jahannam, neighbors notice such things. When the first true transformation happens, it must be terrible in its intimacy. Perhaps it is late, the moon high and full over those crooked roofs. Inside a single house, someone's bones reshape themselves under their skin. Fingers lengthen. A voice slips into a growl that is no longer quite human. Furniture scrapes across the floor. Then come the sounds that no one wants to hear. Claws on wood, a cry cut short, the heavy, stumbling impact of something that no longer walks upright. By morning, the church knows. They have always known, somewhere behind their hymns and rituals, that the old blood can do this, that it does not merely heal, but transform in Old Jahannam. That quiet knowledge steps out of the margins and into the center of the page. Hunters are sent. They come down from the higher districts, cloaks brushing stone, weapons hidden beneath. Among them are hunters associated with the powder kegs, loud and inventive, fond of weapons that roar with fire and shrapnel, and others of quieter temperament, more given to blades and careful strikes. Together, they step into streets that have begun to echo with sounds no human throat should make. The hunts in Old Johannem do not happen all at once. For a time, the church tries to treat the outbreak as a series of isolated incidents. A patient here, a patient there, a house cordoned off, a street quietly evacuated. At night, people awake to the sound of struggle outside, of snarls and shouted prayers, and in the morning they find blood on the pavement, quickly washed away, and new symbols painted on certain doorways. But the scourge of beasts is not gentle once it takes root. Every beast slain spills more tainted blood into the cobblestones, more traces into the soil and water. Those who have not yet succumbed live in a constant state of tension, fear pressing against their ribs like a second cage. Lamps burn later. Doors are barred more firmly. Even in the light of day, eyes watch the alleys for any sign that someone they know is beginning to move in a way that is not quite right. Somewhere above all this, in the high chambers of the cathedral ward, decisions are being weighed. Old Johannem is not just a place on a map anymore. It is a wound that will not close. Every new case of sickness, every new beastly transformation, is a message written in bone and claw. The old blood's promise comes with a cost too high to pay quietly. The records do not show us Laurence's hand signing an order. We do not hear his voice as he speaks in the councils behind locked doors. But as first vicar, as the man whose vision has raised the healing church from an idea into an institution towering over Johannem, he stands at the top of the structure that now faces a terrible choice. Contain the fire, or let it spread. The solution they choose writes itself into the blackened stone of Old Johannem, and into the nightmares of those who survive. When the night of burning comes, it does not begin with fanfare. Fire rarely does. Perhaps there is a brief, unnatural silence first, like the deep breath before a shout. Then, the crackle of torches, the hollow thump of barrels being rolled into position, the soft clink of metal as hunters check their weapons one last time. The flames, when they bloom, are not for warmth or comfort. They leap along rooftops and up through broken windows, driven by oil and intention. Old Johannem is set alight. From the high bridges of the upper city, some may watch the glow rise like a second dawn on the horizon, orange and furious. Smoke braids itself into the night sky, carrying with it the last sense of wood, cloth, and lives uprooted in a single, dreadful act of cleansing. On the ground, in the choking heat, beasts scream. They were once citizens, patients, neighbors. Now, twisted by the very blood they trusted, they stumble and lunge through narrow streets that have become rivers of fire. Hunters move through this inferno like shadows, steel and flame working together to cut down anything that moves in the wrong shape. Somewhere amidst all this, one hunter in particular watches and breaks. Jura. He is remembered in the long, blood-drenched years that follow as an old hunter perched high above the ruins of Old Johannem, his great gun roaring at anyone who dares to set foot in the ashes below. But on that night of burning, he is younger. He walks the same streets as the other hunters, gun in hand, eye eyes filled not just with duty, but with horror. As the beasts burn, he sees in them not mere monsters, but echoes of the people they once were. The baker who sold bread on the corner, the boy who ran barefoot down the alley, the woman who once offered him a cup of water on a hot day. All of them trusted the healing church, all bared their arms for the needle, accepting the old blood into their veins like a blessing. Now the church is burning them. It is, in its own grim logic, a containment measure, a sacrifice of one district to protect the rest of the city. To those who make the decision, the flames may seem like a harsh mercy, a necessary act to keep the scourge from spreading beyond control. To those in Old Johannem, trapped between their own changing bodies and the fire closing in, it feels like betrayal. The fire-soaked betrayal at the heart of Laurence's story shows one of its clearest faces here, a neighborhood once healed by the church's blood, now consigned to ash by the church's flame. If Laurence stands at a high window that night and watches the glow on the horizon, what does he feel? Relief that the spread might be checked, grief for the lives lost, or something more complex? A tightening of the heart that knows this is the price of the path he chose long ago on the shore of Bergenwerth's lake. The world does not tell us. What we do know is what follows. Old Johannem is sealed. Bridges are cut, approaches blocked. Ash cools slowly over bricks and bones. The healing church, in its lofty halls, declares the district off limits, a place of scourge and danger that no one should enter. The official narrative becomes one of painful necessity. The church did what it must to protect the greater whole, but memory lingers in stone. Jura remembers. He takes it upon himself to remain as guardian over the ruins, driving away any who would descend to slaughter the beasts that still linger there. His compassion, twisted by grief, turns toward the very creatures most hunters consider their sworn enemies. And deep beneath the soot, in the story's quieter layers, the city's trust is scarred. People in other districts look toward the sealed-off quarter and understand, in a way that cannot be put into simple sermons, that the church is willing to burn what it cannot control. The same hands that offer healing can, if pushed, carry torches. Laurence's church emerges from this act still standing, still powerful, its cathedrals untouched by the flames that devoured Old Johannem. But the tide of events has turned. The scourge is no longer a rumor whispered in lower alleys. It is a truth written in charcoal and ruin. From this point on, the fire will never truly go out. It burns in the hearts of hunters, in the dreams of survivors, and in the nightmare that will one day claim Laurence himself. A nightmare where the fire that was once used to cleanse others will cling to his own bestial form, refusing to let go. For now, the embers of Old Johannem's destruction glow quietly in the background of his story. The first vicar still walks the bright corridors of his cathedral, the scourge not yet fully on his own flesh, while in the distance, a ruined district smoulders in silence, a sign of what the healing church is willing to do in the name of salvation. The ruins of Old Johannem do not disappear from the city's memory. They linger at the edge of thought like a tooth that has been pulled but still aches. People go on with their lives, buying bread, lighting lamps, visiting clinics. But whenever the wind blows from the burned quarter, carrying with it the faint, bitter smell of ash and something older, eyes flick toward the sealed streets and then away again, as if afraid that the city might remember too clearly what has been done. The healing church, however, cannot afford to look away. the scourge of beasts has shown its teeth, and the fire that consumed old Johannem has only held it at bay. Somewhere within the church's upper chambers, a quiet understanding settles over the vicarage and the workshops. This is no brief crisis. This is the shape of the future. If the city is to endure, it will need hunters who are no longer improvising in the dark. In time, one name rises to the forefront of that effort: Ludwig. In later years, he will be remembered in two very different forms: as Ludwig the Holy Blade, first and greatest hunter of the Healing Church, and as Ludwig the Accursed, a howling beast trapped in the nightmare. But in the years after old Johannem's burning, he is, before anything else, an answer to a question the Church can no longer avoid. How do you fight what your own blood has created? You might picture Ludwig walking through one of the church's vaulted halls, the sound of his boots echoing off stone. Around him, clerics and scribes step aside with a certain respect that borders on reverence. He is not robed like a vicar. His garments are meant for motion and battle, reinforced leather and mail beneath a long coat, weapons strapped to his back and hip. Where other churchmen carry vials and scrolls, Ludwig carries steel. He has seen the beasts up close. He has walked streets in the dead of night, his lantern picking out shapes that no longer fit inside human silhouettes. He has heard the sounds that escape a throat caught halfway between a scream and a howl. He knows that this scourge cannot be tamed by sermons alone. It must be met with something just as fierce. Under his guidance, the hunters of the Healing Church begin to change. What were once scattered fighters and desperate volunteers, drawn in from the older hunter's workshop and from among ordinary Johannemites, start to become an organized corps. Training is formalized. Techniques are recorded, refined, and passed down. New weapons are forged, cruelly clever things that unfold and transform, able to cut cleanly through flesh that no longer respects ordinary rules. The Healing Church workshop, raised high above the city, becomes the beating heart of this martial arm. In that place, under roof beams darkened by years of oil and smoke, artisans and hunters work side by side. Blades are balanced for quick strikes and heavy blows. Firearms are tuned to deliver staggering force in a single decisive shot. Each new tool is born from long nights of trial and error, from hunts that end in victory, and those that end with a hunter carried home on a stretcher, or not at all. Ludwig's influence spreads beyond mere equipment. He becomes, for many in Johannem, the face of the church's protection. Stories circulate of his deeds, how he charges into streets overrun with beasts and carves a path for civilians to escape, how he stands his ground in front of clinic doors, refusing to retreat even when surrounded on all sides, how he rallies hunters whose hands shake from fear, reminding them of the duty they carry, not only to the church's pride, but to the ordinary people sleeping behind thin walls. For a time, his name is spoken with gratitude. Parents quiet frightened children by saying that Ludwig's hunters are watching the night. Merchants glance up at the cathedral ward and feel a little safer, knowing that somewhere up there, a man with a great sword and a steadfast heart is planning the next patrol, the next response. Laurence, as first vicar, must see immense value in this. The Healing Church is no longer just a place of healing and prayer. It is a force with armed hands and sharp teeth. The hunters represent a way to control the consequences of the old blood's use, to keep the city from collapsing under the weight of the very miracles the church has promised. Perhaps there are meetings between Laurence and Ludwig in candlelit chambers, a map of Jehannam spread out on the table between them. They might speak of districts most plagued by the scourge, of routes for patrols, of which clinics require guard details. Laurence, robed and solemn. Ludwig, armoured and restless as, fingers tracing lines on the map that lead into the darkest corners of the city. Two men, united for a time by the belief that the Church can still steer the future. Beneath this growing martial strength, though, the Church's ambitions do not remain fixed on simple survival. Somewhere above the older school, and apart from Ludwig's workshop, in the highest reaches of the cathedral ward, another path unfolds, quiet and steep. The choir, this group, cloistered yet influential, looks beyond the immediate crisis of beasts and burning districts. Their gaze turns upward, toward the great ones themselves. While Ludwig's hunters try to manage the scourge in the streets, the choir seeks to understand, and, in their own way, to join. The distant entities whose blood fuels both healing and horror. Their halls are high and dim, their rituals hushed. They study not only blood, but eyes, augurs and phantasms that open fleeting windows into the presence of beings beyond. They believe that to transcend the limits of humanity, one must achieve a higher state of insight, a mind and spirit stitched through with understanding of the cosmos. In the depths beyond their sanctum, they make contact with something that seems to bear out their theories, a great one left behind, whom they call Ebrietas. In her strange, luminescent form, the choir sees the outline of their hopes. They do not raise swords against her. They kneel before her, not as hunters before a beast, but as supplicants before a god through communion with her and the rites built around her presence. They hope to glimpse paths of evolution that do not end in slavering jaws and matted fur, but in something grander and more serene. Laurence's original vision, born on the shores of Bergenwerth's lake, begins to stretch in strange directions. The church he founded now holds two very different forms of power in its hands. One, embodied by Ludwig and his hunters, is immediate, blood-soaked, and loud. The roar of guns, the clash of steel, the burning of districts when all else fails. The other, embodied by the choir, is quiet and lofty, steeped in whispered rites and silent gazes turned toward impossible stars. Between them, like a pillar of stone anchoring this growing edifice, stands the figure of the first vicar. We do not know how fully Laurence understands or endorses every path the church takes in his name, but the institution's reach continues to expand under his tenure, and its faith in the old blood remains unshaken in public. To question the blood now is to question not only the church's past, but its entire identity. So the doubts, if any exist, are spoken only in private, if at all. Beyond Jehannam's streets, the church's shadow falls across other lands. To the distant north, in a castle half buried in snow and mist, an ancient noble line practices its own form of blood worship. Canehurst. There, a queen sits on a cold throne, sustained by a sanguine tradition not sanctioned by the healing church. The details of the feud between Canehurst and Laurence's institution are as misted as the frozen air surrounding the castle, but its outlines can be traced. The vile bloods of Canehurst are branded as corrupt, an affront to the church's teachings and authority. The executioners, fanatical warriors loyal to the church's cause, march under sacred emblems, convinced that they are carrying out a holy purge. When they reach the castle walls, their purpose is not to parley, but to exterminate. The conflict that follows leaves Canehurst a haunted, forsaken place. The nobles are slaughtered, the road to the castle destroyed, and the surviving queen locked in a strange, undying half-life, guarded by the martyr who led the assault. It is another example of the Church's willingness to meet perceived threats, not with dialogue, but with the sword. Each of these actions, burning a district, sending executioners to a distant castle, delving deeper into forbidden communion, etches another line into the story of Laurence's legacy. A pattern emerges. When faced with something it cannot control, the Church does not step back and reconsider its use of the old blood. It tightens its grip, sharpens its blades, and widens its reach. Within Johannem, Ludwig's hunters fight night after night, their coats growing heavy with dried blood and ash. Many of them revere Laurence as the guiding light of the Church, the man whose faith justifies their own sacrifices. They believe that if they keep fighting, if they keep the beasts at bay, someday the city will pass through this trial into a new, purified age. They speak of holy blades, of noble hunts, of a destiny that makes every scar worthwhile. And yet, even among the hunters, cracks begin to appear. The longer they fight, the more they see. They see colleagues who succumb to the very scourge they battle, driven mad or twisted in body until they must be struck down by their own comrades. They see districts that cannot be saved, no matter how skilled or brave they are. They see the gap widening between the lofty hopes sung in the cathedral and the raw, brutal work carried out in the gutters. Ludwig himself is not immune. He is a man of conviction, but conviction alone cannot shield a mind from what it witnesses. Night after night, he rides into the dark, his holy moonlight sword or his massive blade carving arcs of pale light through fur and bone. The beasts fall, but more rise. The blood coats his hands and seeps into his dreams. You might imagine him returning to the workshop in the hours before dawn, armor dented, cloak torn, hands trembling slightly as he removes his gauntlets. In the dim light, he stands before a rack of weapons and sees not tools of salvation, but instruments in an endless cycle of violence that never quite reaches its promised end. These are the years when Johannem lives on a knife edge. The healing church is at the height of its power. Cathedrals tower over the city. The choir whispers with beings beyond comprehension. Hunters patrol the streets with weapons honed to cruel precision. And yet, beneath this apparent strength, the foundations are shaking. The old blood continues to flow. It flows in the veins of the faithful, in the hands of clerics, in the bodies of hunters who need its strength to survive their own battles. Each use is another step away from the cautious philosophy of Bergenwerth, another stride along a path that has already led to ash-covered districts and frozen castles. Laurence stands at the center of this spinning wheel, a man who once walked away from his master because he could not bear to leave the world to its suffering. He wanted healing. He wanted to raise humanity to a higher place. He wanted the blood they had found below the earth to be a bridge rather than a chain. But the more the church grows, the more its actions resemble those of a desperate creature, lashing out to maintain control, burning and striking and silencing anything that threatens the fragile balance it has created. Somewhere along this path, though the precise moment is lost to us, the line between healer and beast begins to blur. Not on the streets, where claws and fangs make the distinction obvious, but in the heart of the man who set all of this in motion. The blood he trusts does not spare him because he is a vicar. It watches, patient, in the depths of his veins, the same way it has watched in countless others. The hunters continue their patrols. The choir continues its whispered experiments. The bells of the Grand Cathedral continue to ring over Jehannam, calling the faithful to receive their sacred blood. And somewhere high within those same halls, Laurence, first vicar of the healing church, begins to feel the first quiet stirrings of something inside himself that does not entirely belong to him. A heat in the bones, a tightening of the jaw, a flicker of instinct that has nothing to do with prayer and everything to do with hunger. The fire that burned old Jehannam has not been quenched. It has simply found new fuel. There is a kind of silence that falls before a storm, even inside a man. For Laurence, that silence likely settled first in his own body. He had lived with the old blood longer than almost anyone else in Jehannam. He had overseen its discovery beneath Bergenwerth's grounds, carried it down into the city, and used it in countless rites of healing. If anyone believed he understood it, its power, its limits, its promises, it was Laurence himself. At first, the blood had given him the same things it gave to others. A clearer gaze, a steadier step, a sense of vigor that belied the years of work and worry behind his eyes. When he climbed the long stairs of the Grand Cathedral, robes whispering over stone, there was no tremor in his legs, no falter in his breath. To those who watched him pass, he must have seemed like a pillar carved from the very faith he preached. But there comes a point when the body begins to tell the truth that the mind does not want to hear. Perhaps one morning he rose from his bed in a high chamber of the cathedral ward and felt a weight in his bones that was not simple fatigue. The light through the window caught his hands just so, making the veins stand out beneath the skin. And for a heartbeat, the shape of those fingers seemed longer, the nails a fraction darker than he remembered. He had seen this before in others. He had seen it in patients who had received too many transfusions, whose bodies had begun to respond to the old blood, as if it were not a medicine, but a command. He had seen it in clerics whose devotions had led them to drink deeply of the sacred fluid in hopes of greater communion. He had seen the progression, the small changes, the restlessness, the hunger that was not quite hunger, and then, finally, the moment when humanity slipped like a cloak from their shoulders and something else stood in its place. For the first vicar of the healing church to recognize the same outline in his own reflection would be a quiet, devastating revelation. Outwardly, he could still carry on. Laurence continued to preside over rites, to speak from pulpits beneath high arches, to lay his hand upon the brows of the sick and the faithful. The city still saw him as the anchor of its faith, the man who had brought them the blood that healed and the church that guarded them. But inwardly, the silence grew. How does a man of faith respond when he becomes the very thing his hunters are sworn to destroy? Within the church, scholars and runesmiths continued their work in hidden rooms, where only the scratch of quills and the clink of vials disturbed the air. They recorded every symptom of the scourge, every failed treatment, every sliver of hope. They experimented not only with blood and bone, but with symbols, impressions of sounds and meanings captured by the runesmith carol and set down as runes to be worn close to the mind. Some of those runes offered protection or clarity. Others did something stranger. After repeated experiments in controlling the scourge of beasts, one such rune's description would later say, "The gentle embrace rune was discovered." This was no simple charm for courage. It was an oath, a mark that did not shy away from beasthood, but leaned toward it. Those who swore it could take on a ghastly half-beast form, their transformations accentuated rather than suppressed. its implementation failed. Whatever the church had hoped to achieve with this strange embrace, whether a way to ride the transformation without losing the self, or a method of guiding beasthood into something useful, did not come to pass. The rune was deemed forbidden. Yet its knowledge and the ambition behind it sank into the foundations of the healing church like ink into old paper. All of this, all these attempts to master what the blood was doing, unfolded under the same roof where Laurence felt the quiet storm building in his own veins. For a man already beginning to sense the beast within, the existence of such an oath might have been a dark sort of temptation. If one could control the scourge, if one could bear its strength without surrendering entirely, perhaps there was still a way forward. Perhaps the body could change while the will remained intact. Or perhaps, by the time these thoughts solidified, the choice was no longer truly his. The world does not show us Laurence's last night as a man. We do not see the moment when the weight in his bones became a burning heat, when his hands no longer looked human in any light, when the prayers in his mouth began to twist into sounds that shook the air like a beast's roar. But the remnants we are given are clear enough. In reality, says the description of a certain skull, Laurence became the first cleric beast, not just another victim, but the first of a new, terrible kind, a high-ranking church figure whose very office and devotion had driven him further and further into the blood's embrace until his body answered a different master entirely, the towering, horned creatures that hunters would later face outside cathedrals and in moonlit plazas had, as their origin, the fall of this one man. The church did not keep him in that form. At some point, whether in panic, pity, or grim resolve, hunters and clerics together must have brought him down. Steel and fire against fur and bone. The same tools they used to cleanse the streets now turned upon the very founder of their institution. When it was done, his human skull did not remain in the waking world. Skull of Laurence, first vicar of the healing church, reads the item description in another, darker place. In reality, he became the first cleric beast, and his human skull only exists within the nightmare. The skull is a symbol of Laurence's past and what he failed to protect. In the waking Grand Cathedral, the faithful kneel before an altar where a beastly skull-like relic rests under candlelight, a focal point for veneration and a reminder of a cautionary adage whispered among vicars. To them, it is a holy symbol, part of the tapestry of their faith, but the text makes it plain. Laurence's true human skull no longer lies in Yharnam's stone halls. It has been drawn elsewhere, to a place where memory and punishment coil together. The path that leads him there does not begin in the cathedral. It begins far away, on a shore where the sea meets a lonely hamlet. Long before the night of the hunter's nightmare, long before the sky over Yharnam was torn to reveal a blood-red moon, there was a village by the water where the tide washed over old, strange things. The people there lived close to something that should never have been disturbed. A great one whose broken body lay in the shallows. Kos. When Bergenwerth's hunters came to that place, Gehrman among them, Maria at his side, and, by later implication, Laurence not far removed, they did not come as simple visitors. They came seeking knowledge, blood, and the secrets of the Great Ones. What they did in that fishing hamlet was no clean experiment. The voices of the villagers, echoing through time, call them blasphemous murderers and blood-crazed fiends. Whatever rites were performed there, Whatever desecration was inflicted upon Kos and her kin, it did not go unanswered. The corpse of the Great One lay upon the shore, bloated and still. But in the deep places where such beings truly dwell, something woke. A curse was spoken, or perhaps simply released, over the blood-drunk hunters who had dared to carve into that sacred flesh. Curse the fiends, their children too, murmurs the voice that lingers over the hamlet, and their children, forever, true, true. This curse does not simply kill, it entangles. It reaches out across years and across the thin skin that separates waking reality from the places where nightmares take root. Those who participated in or inherited the sins of that slaughter find themselves bound in a realm not entirely their own, a distorted reflection of Jehannam and its outskirts, stitched together from memories, regrets, and unending hunts. The hunter's nightmare. Laurence is among those caught in that net. The scholar who left Bergenwerth, the first vicar who spread the old blood, the man whose choices led to burning districts and beasthood in the streets, is not allowed to simply die and be done. The curse laid by Kos coils around him, as surely as it does around Gehrman, Ludwig, and so many others. His fate is not to pass quietly into whatever rest awaits ordinary souls. Instead, he is imprisoned in a nightmare echo of his own cathedral. There, upon an altar carved with the image of a veiled, headless figure pouring out a vessel, Laurence appears not as a man, but as the cleric beast he became, wreathed in a fire that will not go out. And somewhere else in that same twisted reflection of the church's domain, his human skull rests upon another altar, a pale, silent witness to everything he failed to protect. He is destined, the description tells us, to seek that skull, destined to reach for the symbol of his former life and mission, never able to reclaim the memories it once held, left to burn without rest, without recollection, caught between the beast he is and the man he can no longer remember being. In the waking world, Jehannam continues to turn. Bells ring. Hunters walk the streets. Vicars whisper their adage about fearing the frailty of men and the lure of the old blood. The skull upon the cathedral altar glows faintly in the dim light, a relic that most will never truly understand. In the nightmare, the fire around Laurence never truly fades. The storm that had been gathering in his veins, the consequences of every choice he made from Bergenwerth onward, has broken over him at last, not in a single night, but in all nights at once folded together. It is there, in that burning echo of the grand cathedral, that a wandering hunter may one day meet him face to face and see what becomes of a man who tried to heal a world with the blood of gods. The path to that meeting, however, belongs to another part of the story. The hunter's nightmare is not a place one stumbles into by accident. Those who find themselves there have already walked long roads in the waking world, streets slick with blood, forests whispering with unseen things, castles where the wind rattles through empty armor. They have taken on the mantle of hunter, and in doing so, have stepped a little closer to the deep, old currents that run beneath Jehannam's cobblestones. When such a hunter first feels the nightmare closing around them, it may come like the slow fading of a candlelit room, replaced by a similar space with its shadows bent a different way. The sky, when they look up, is wrong. The moon hangs low and red, swollen with light that never becomes day. Buildings are familiar and yet warped, as if they have been remembered rather than seen. Here, the sins of the past are not buried, they walk. Somewhere within this tangle of half-remembered streets and twisted halls stands a place that feels uncomfortably like home. A surgery altar in a quiet, white-walled chamber. An operating table that also serves as an elevator. In the waking world, a similar altar leads down toward the healing church's hidden research. In the nightmare, it does the same. Hunters step onto it and feel it descend, carrying them toward the research hall with its towers of beds and whispering patients. But if one pauses in that room and pays attention, they may notice something else. Beneath the main altar, hidden just out of sight, there is another. If the hunter sends the altar upward and then darts away at the right moment, the rising stone reveals a second, smaller platform below. It waits in stillness, overlooked by those who rush past, as if it has been set aside for a different kind of burden. On that lower altar lies a skull. It is not wrapped in ceremony here. No vestments, no candles, only cool stone and the faint scent of old blood that never quite leaves these places, yet the skull itself is strangely whole, more human in its lines than the beastly relic that sits in the waking Grand Cathedral. To look at it too long is to feel the shape of a life that has already burned itself away. Laurence's skull. For the nightmare's hunter, lifting it is a quiet act. There is no choir to watch, no vicar to bless the moment, only the weight of bone in their hands, and the knowledge, felt rather than spoken, that this object is tied to the beginning of the healing church, and to the man whose choices have echoed through every street they have walked. With the skull secured, the hunter moves on. They climb and descend through the nightmare's distorted landscape, past rusted cannons and crumbling bridges, through plazas choked with beast patients and old hunters who have forgotten what they once fought for. The red sky never lightens. Time folds in on itself, and yet somehow all roads curve back toward a single destination. A cathedral that is at once familiar and deeply wrong. The nightmare Grand Cathedral stands where its waking counterpart stands, its doors heavy, its steps worn. But here the stone is blackened and cracked, as if it has been licked again and again by a fire that no rain can quench. Ash gathers in the corners like dust. The great windows stare down with empty, darkened eyes. The first time the hunter reaches this place, they may find a massive, smouldering shape slumped upon the altar steps. A cleric beast, but wreathed in an odd, unmoving fire, as if frozen in the midst of burning. It does not rise. Its head hangs low. The air around it shimmers faintly with heat, but there is no roar, no lunge. The hunter passes close enough to see the ridges of bone and the taut, twisted muscles beneath scorched skin, and then must move on, leaving the silent thing where it lies. Only later, when they return carrying Laurence's skull, does the nightmare truly listen. As the hunter approaches the altar, the skull carefully cradled, the flames across that slumped body flicker. A tremor runs through the great limbs. For a moment, the cathedral seems to hold its breath, the ash in the air hanging motionless. Then the fire surges. The beast that bears Laurence's name draws in a slow, rumbling breath, embers flaring to life along its arms and spine. Where before it had been unnaturally still, it now shifts with a ponderous, waking motion. The skull in the hunter's hands has become a kind of key, not of metal, but of memory, a reminder of what he was, brought into the place where what he became is trapped. Laurence rises. The sound is like ancient timbers shifting under the strain of a storm. Charred limbs unfold, joints cracking as molten light seeps through. The huge body straightens into a posture that echoes the first cleric beast the hunter may have fought in Yharnam. Towering, long-limbed, antlered, yet here wrapped in an inextinguishable fire. Each step he takes leaves a faint glow on the stone, as if his weight brands the floor itself. For a time, the struggle that follows feels almost like a reflection of that earlier encounter. Laurence's arms sweep in great arcs, his claws carving fiery paths through the air. He hammers at the ground, sending out bursts of heat and force that crack the cathedral floor. The hunter weaves between these blows, timing their movements with a precision honed across many nights in Yharnam's streets. In these moments, the battle is fierce but familiar. A dance of distance and timing, of reading the rhythm of a beast's rage. Yet the fire makes everything sharper. Every near miss sears the air. Every strike landed against his burning limbs sends up a spray of sparks. The heat presses against the hunter's lungs, demanding shallower breaths, urging haste where calm is needed. It is not merely a physical trial, but a test of whether one can remain steady in the presence of a flame that has devoured so much. As the battle wears on and Laurence's strength is worn down, something in his body gives way. With a roar that shakes dust from the high arches, he tears himself apart at the waist, his upper body wrenching free of the lower limbs that have carried him this far. The great beast crashes to the ground, no longer able to stand, and begins to drag itself forward on arms that now spill molten blood with every movement. The fight changes. Laurence crawls, his torso leaving trails of glowing, lava-like fluid across the stone. The floor itself becomes treacherous. Patches of searing heat spread outward, slow but deadly, turning portions of the cathedral into shimmering pools of danger. Where he once relied on wide, sweeping blows, he now lashes out in surges, lunging and spewing burning liquid in short, vicious bursts. It is a pitiable sight in its way. The first vicar of the healing church, once robed and revered, is reduced to a crawling, half-dissolved shape, dragging himself through a cathedral that mirrors his own inner ruin. The fire he called upon as a tool of cleansing now pours from his body without restraint, a constant, uncontrolled outpouring that threatens everything around him. The hunter must adapt again. They move not only around Laurence himself, but around the lines of molten blood he leaves behind, watching the floor as carefully as the beast. Every opening is brief and costly. Each successful strike feels less like a blow against a simple enemy and more like chipping away at a monument to an old, terrible decision. At last, a moment comes when the roaring slackens. Laurence gathers himself for another lunge, but the strength does not fully answer. The fire gutters along his back and shoulders, blaring high one last time before thinning. In that fragile gap, the hunter steps in and delivers the final necessary blow. The sound that follows is not so much a scream as a long, shuddering exhalation. Flames leap up around the ruined body, brighter than ever, and then begin to recede. The molten patches on the floor cool, turning from glowing orange to dull. Cracked stone embers drift downward, settling in gentle arcs, like a brief, strange snowfall of light. The great beast's arm falls still. The burning that has clung to Laurence through nightmare and memory finally begins to loosen its hold. The hunter's nightmare, sensing the end of one of its most powerful echoes, grows quiet around the cathedral. In the space where his blazing form lay, something else remains. It is not a relic of bone or cloth, but a mark, an oath rune that can be taken into the hunter's very being. Those who accept it find their bodies shift subtly, movements growing more feral, their outline touched by the suggestion of fur and fangs. Beasts embrace. It is the product of the church's experiments in controlling the scourge, a gentle rune meant to let one acknowledge and shape the inner beast rather than be consumed by it. In the end, its implementation failed, and it was deemed forbidden. But the knowledge behind it became part of the healing church's very foundation. Now it lies here, offered by the fall of the man whose path led the church to such dangerous understanding. To take this rune upon oneself is to make a deliberate choice. Hunters who do so do not simply gain strength. They step into a form that mirrors, in small, flickering ways, the cleric beasts and the first vicar himself. Their steps become low and prowling. Their attacks, especially with certain weapons, take on a wild, clawing edge. It is power gained by acknowledging the closeness of the line between hunter and beast. Some will refuse it. They have seen too much of what the beast inside men can do. They prefer to stay as they are, even if it means standing a little further from the fire. Others, driven by curiosity or necessity, will take the rune into themselves, trusting that they can stand upon that narrow ledge without slipping. Either way, Laurence's final lesson is not a comfortable one. He does not leave behind a shining cure or a simple warning. He leaves a choice to embrace, cautiously and knowingly, the very thing that has devoured so many, or to stand apart and watch that struggle from a distance. The cathedral in the nightmare grows still. Ash settles in soft, uneven layers over the cracked floor. The heat in the air fades to a lingering warmth, the kind that remains after a long fire has finally died down. Outside, the sky stays its same unnatural red, but within this hall, for the first time in a very long while, Laurence's echo is at rest. In the waking world, the Grand Cathedral continues to hold its own skull-shaped relic, watched by candles and solemn statues. The people of Yehanam still climb its steps with hopes and fears cradled in their hands. They do not know of the burning beast in the nightmare's reflection, or of the hunter who finally, mercifully, brought it to an end. They only know that their city is strange, that their nights are long, and that somewhere above them, bells still toll. For the hunter who has walked both worlds, the picture is more complete. They have seen the ashen bones of old Yarnum. They have traced their fingers along the worn tools in the old workshop. They have climbed the warped steps of the nightmare's cathedral and watched a man's legacy burn itself out. They carry deep in their memory the understanding that a single decision, to trust a perilous miracle, can ripple outward through generations. Now, stepping out of that scorched hall, they find something rare in this world, a pocket of true quiet. No roaring beasts, no chanting choir, only the soft scrape of their own boots on stone, the steady rhythm of their breath, and the faintest echo of fading fire behind them. The hunter's nightmare still sprawls in every direction, full of battles yet to be fought. But one story, at least, has reached its end. The fire that once defined Laurence, the first vicar, has finally gone out. What remains is not triumph, but a calm, heavy stillness, the kind that settles after a long, hard storm, when the last drops of rain have fallen, and only the memory of thunder lingers at the edge of thought. In the end, Laurence's story is not only about blood. It is about a man who could not bear to look at suffering and do nothing. a scholar who stood between a dying world and a discovery that seemed, at first, like the answer to every whispered prayer in a sick room. The old blood did not begin as a weapon in his hands. It began as hope. If you trace his steps back through the tangled paths we've walked tonight, you can still find the moments where that hope shines the brightest. A lake at Bergenwerth, mist curling over water that reflects a distant moon. A lecture hall where ideas move like constellations across a blackboard. A young man listening to his master say, softly but firmly, "Fear the old blood," and feeling, in the quiet ache of his own heart, that fear alone is not enough. Later, the narrow streets of Johannem, a cramped clinic where the air smells of damp cloth and desperation. A patient who has already been given up for lost, sitting up with new strength after a few drops of something strange and potent are slipped into their veins, the look in their eyes, the tears on the face of someone at their bedside, the way that one small act of healing can ripple outward through an entire family, an entire neighborhood. For a time, the story could almost have ended there. Laurence could have taken the old blood and used it sparingly, cautiously. He could have stepped back from it once the first troubling signs appeared. But he was not a man who stepped back. He had already crossed that line when he walked away from Bergenwerth's caution. Once he saw what the blood could do, it must have been almost impossible for him to imagine turning away from it. The healing church grew from that refusal. Cathedrals rose, beautiful and imposing. Choirs sang. Candles flickered before altars where blood was offered, not merely as medicine, but as sacrament. People who had known only fear and weakness found a new language for their lives. The language of ascension, of transcendence, of a future where humanity would no longer be bound by ordinary limits. There is a warmth in that dream. You can feel it if you sit very still and let yourself remember a time when you believed that every problem could be solved, if only you were brave enough, clever enough, determined enough to keep pushing forward. For Laurence, that feeling never truly left. Even as the cost of his choices became harder to ignore, he kept believing, or needing to believe, that they led somewhere better. But fire, once lit, does not ask where you intend it to burn. In old Johannem's ashen streets, the church's fire spreads through homes that once welcomed its clerics. The same faith that opened doors to blood ministration now finds those doors forced open from the other side, torches in hand. The people who trusted the church most deeply become the ones sacrificed first in the name of containment. Jura's watchful gun, forever aimed over the ruins in the time of the hunt, feels like a simple, stubborn answer to that kind of salvation. Far away, in Canehurst's frozen halls, the church's reach extends beyond the city's borders. Executioners march under holy symbols, convinced that their blades are instruments of purification. The snow preserves what the fire cannot touch. Empty corridors, silent thrones, the lingering shape of a feud between two different visions of what blood should mean. And farther still, in a fishing hamlet by the shore, a washed-up great one draws together reverence and greed. Hunters and scholars walk those slick planks with tools and theories, turning worship into dissection. The curse that rises from that place does not distinguish between individual guilt and institutional hubris. It gathers all of it together. The blood-drunk hunts, the secret experiments, the burning of districts and the razing of castles, and weaves it into the fabric of a nightmare where such deeds cannot be forgotten. Laurence does not act alone in any of this. The healing church is not a single man, but a tangle of voices and ambitions. Ludwig and his hunters, Gehrman's old workshop stories, the choir and their pale communion, the executioners and their absolute zeal. Yet he stands near the beginning of the line. The rails he lays with the best of intentions carry others into choices they might never have made on their own. When the blood finally turns on him, it does so without malice. It simply follows its nature. The same currents that twist clinic patients and exhausted hunters begin to move through his veins. The first subtle changes in his body are not punishments. They are consequences, each sermon preached, each vial poured, each time he chooses to press forward rather than pause and reconsider. All of it slowly tightening around him like a cloak woven from firelight and shadow. By the time he becomes the first cleric beast, there may be little left in him that does not bear the weight of those choices. And yet, in the hunter's nightmare, when a hunter carries his skull up the long warped steps to the burning cathedral, there is room to imagine that some fragment of the men still recognizes what is happening. The hunter does not come as a congregation. There are no hymns, no ceremony, only two figures in a ruined hall, one small, one vast, both shaped by the same tide of blood and necessity. They meet in a space where words have long since burned away, where only the echo of actions remains. Their clash is violent, yes, but it is also strangely intimate. Each time the hunter slips just beyond the reach of a flaming limb, they are stepping out of the path Laurence himself walked so long ago. Each careful strike says, in its own quiet way, this is where it should have stopped. This is where someone, anyone, should have put down the torch. When the fire around him finally fails, leaving only embers and smoke, the silence that follows does not feel triumphant. It feels like the end of a long, feverish dream. You might imagine, in that moment, that the man who once stood in Birkenwerth's lecture hall catches a final glimpse of his own life, laid out behind him like a trail of lanterns, not in sharp detail, not in words, but as a gentle recognition that he wanted to mend the world, and instead tore it in a different place. The rune he leaves behind, the beast's embrace, is a fitting coda. It does not offer clarity or safety or absolution. It offers a dangerous kind of understanding that to fight the scourge is to come close to it, to borrow some of its wildness, to accept that you cannot stand entirely apart from the forces you struggle against. Hunters who take this mark upon themselves are not simply stronger. They are accepting a burden that says, I know how thin this line is. I choose to walk it anyway. Laurence's life can be read as a long attempt to walk that same edge. He refuses to let fear of the old blood paralyze him. He believes that embracing its power carefully, purposefully, will usher in a new age. In the end, it consumes him. But along the way, he does bring healing. He does lift people from their beds. He does inspire courage in hunters like Ludwig, and a sense of purpose in those who kneel in the pews of his cathedrals. It is tempting, in stories, to divide people into saints and monsters. Blood-stained Yehanam does not do that. It gives us a city where almost every figure is a mixture of noble intent and terrible consequence. Gehrman, dragging his worn body through the workshop Ludwig, exalted and then broken. The choir, gazing upward until they vanish into the very sky they worship. And Laurence, who turns his back on fear and walks straight into the arms of a different kind of ruin. If you sit quietly with his story, you may find that it has less to do with judging him than with understanding the shape of his choices. He stands at the place where compassion and hubris meet, where the desire to heal becomes entangled with the refusal to accept limits, where fire is used to guide and then to erase, where a man looks at suffering and says, "I will not stand aside," but does not fully reckon with what might happen if the tool he uses to end that suffering cannot be fully controlled. Jahannam, with its leaning houses and endless steps, bears the marks of that entanglement. Its clinics and cathedrals are built on the same foundations. Its hunters and beasts are born from the same blood. Its nights are long because one man, and those who follow him, tried to leap ahead on a path that perhaps was never meant to be rushed. And you, listening now, have walked those streets in your imagination. You have stood beneath the cold eyes of statues in the cathedral ward. You have felt the heat of old Jahannam's distant fires. You have watched a towering cleric beast burn in a hall that exists only where guilt and memory overlap. All of it illuminated by a small, steady light. The understanding that every great change in this world begins with a single human decision. Here, as the night grows softer around you, the story begins to fade. The grand cathedral's bells grow faint, as if heard from very far away. The flames in the nightmare's warped hall shrink down to a few glowing coals. The hunters drift back into the red mist that birthed them. The fishing hamlet lies quiet under its eternal grey sky. And somewhere, on an altar, waking or dreamt, a skull rests in silence. It does not speak. It does not offer answers. It simply bears witness to a life that begins with a refusal to be afraid and ends in a fire that will not go out until someone else, at great cost, helps it finally to fade. Let the last of those embers dim now. The cathedral's stone floor cools underfoot. The ash settles in thin, gentle layers over broken pews and silent steps. Outside, the sky above Jahannam, nightmarish or otherwise, darkens into something closer to peace. The shapes of towers and rooftops blur, becoming only shadows at the edge of vision. You are not in that world. You are here, where the only fire is a quiet one, and the only sound is the slow, familiar rhythm of your own breath. The roads and cathedrals and burning halls you've walked tonight are stories, nothing more, nothing less. They can be set down when you are ready. For now, you can let your thoughts loosen, the way embers drift apart at the end of a long burning log. If they return to Laurence, they will find him at rest, his long struggle finally still. If they wander elsewhere toward other cities or other tales, they will go carrying the simple understanding that even in worlds of blood and nightmare, the deepest currents are made of human choices, human hopes, and human mistakes. The night outside the window is deep and calm. You have gone as far as you need to go with this story. The fire is low. The echoes have grown quiet. You can stay awake with these thoughts if you wish, or you can let them fade, allowing your eyes to grow heavy, your breathing to lengthen, and the world to soften around the edges. Either way, the tale of Laurence, the first vicar, and the healing church's fire-soaked betrayal has reached its end. The rest belongs to sleep,